The surveillance cameras outside the convenience store in Anchorage, Alaska, captured nothing out of the ordinary on the night of September 6, 2019. A man and a woman walked through the rain, their movements unhurried, their conversation casual. The man was 48-year-old Brian Smith. The woman was Valerie Kassler. She had met him just hours earlier when he pulled his truck to the side of a dark street and offered her a ride out of the weather. She was homeless, living in a tent, and the rain that night had been relentless. She accepted without hesitation. What she did not know was that in the bed of the truck, concealed beneath a tarp and a jumble of camping gear, lay the body of a woman Brian had killed less than 24 hours earlier. That woman was Kathleen Jo Henry, 52 years old, whose life had ended in a hotel room while Brian recorded her final moments on a camera he kept for his outdoor adventures. Valerie waited in the passenger seat while Brian went inside to buy drinks. In the quiet of the cab, she dropped her phone onto the floorboard. She reached down to retrieve it, her fingers brushing against two devices in the darkness. She picked them both up without thinking, slipping them into her pocket. It was a small mistake, the kind anyone could make, but that mistake would unravel everything. When Valerie returned to her tent later that night and reached into her pocket, she pulled out a phone that did not belong to her. She scrolled through it, confused by the unfamiliar contacts and numbers. Then she found a folder. Its label stopped her cold. Homicide, Marriott Hotel, Midtown, Anchorage. Inside were videos, and in those videos, a voice she recognized. What Valerie saw on that phone screen defied comprehension. She scrolled through dozens of files, each one labeled with clinical precision, each one containing images and videos that documented violence in high definition. The first video showed a hotel room. The lighting was harsh, the angles uneven, as though the person holding the camera was more focused on the scene before them than on the quality of the recording. On the floor lay a woman. She was alive at the beginning of the footage, but barely. The camera moved closer. A voice filled the room, calm and measured, with an accent that carried traces of England and something else. The voice spoke to the woman on the floor as though delivering a lecture.
I'm drinking, come on. What your whiskey's supposed to go through, and it's already like come on, just take one for the team. Huh? Take it for the team. Take it for the team. Super. I know this is like weird, but swallow it. Just fucking swallow it. Secure your sweet ass down to my car and go dump you somewhere, huh? You just up my entire evening. Huh? Just finish, please. I'm tired. I need to go on straight and narrow.
You live, you die. You live, you die. Sadly, in my movies, everyone dies. The woman tried to move. The camera did not waver. Valerie watched until she could not watch anymore. She scrolled to another file, then another. Each one was disturbingly similar. The same voice, the same cold, observational tone, the same woman, or perhaps different women. It was hard to tell from the fragments she could bring herself to view. In one video, the voice narrated the act of strangulation as though describing a scene from a film. In another, the camera captured a hotel key card, a pair of shoes, the edge of a truck bed. The voice spoke about evolution, about death, about the inability of people to simply die when they were told to. Valerie sat in her tent, the phone trembling in her hands, and understood that she had just spent hours alone in a truck with a man who recorded murder. And she understood that if he discovered the phone was missing, she might become his next subject. For the next several days, Valerie Kassler did not leave her tent. She stayed hidden in the woods near the edge of Anchorage, where the city gave way to birch and spruce and the silence of the Alaskan wilderness. Every sound became a threat. Every set of headlights that passed on the nearby road could have been his truck. Every footstep in the undergrowth could have been him searching for her. She knew Brian Smith had her phone. She knew he would eventually realize she had his. And she knew, from the videos she had watched, what happened to people who crossed his path. The paranoia consumed her. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. She lay in her tent with the SD card clutched in her hand, replaying the footage in her mind, trying to convince herself that what she had seen was not real. But it was real. She had heard his voice. She had seen his hands. She had watched a woman die on the floor of a hotel room while he narrated the moment with the detachment of someone reviewing footage from a nature documentary. The phone sat in her pocket, a ticking thing, a piece of evidence that tied her to a killer. She could not keep it forever. She could not destroy it, and she could not go to the police without risking exposure. But hiding would not protect her. If Brian found her, the next video on that SD card would be about her. She knew that with absolute certainty. So after days of paralysis, Valerie made a choice. She emerged from the woods. She walked to the Anchorage Police Department, and she handed the SD card to the first officer she could find, along with the story of the man who had picked her up on a rainy night and driven her around a city where a body lay cooling in the back of his truck. The detectives who reviewed the footage from the SD card were veterans of law enforcement. They had seen the worst of what humans could do to one another. But what they watched in that evidence room was unlike anything they had encountered before. The videos were not the product of a spontaneous act of violence. They were composed, deliberate. The person behind the camera was not simply documenting a crime, he was directing it. He spoke to his victim as though she were an audience. He adjusted the camera angle. He commented on her breathing, her movements, her resistance. And when she stopped moving, he kept recording. One detective watched the footage repeatedly, studying every frame for details that might identify the perpetrator. The hotel room, the key card, the pattern on the carpet, the distinctive voice that narrated the entire event with an accent that mixed English cadences with something else. That voice triggered a memory. Years earlier, the detective had worked a case involving a man with that same accent. The man had been questioned about an unrelated matter and released, but his voice had lingered in the detective's memory. His name was Brian Stephen Smith. With a suspect now in view, investigators cross-referenced the footage with other recent cases. Just 1 week before Valerie Kassler walked into the police station, human remains had been discovered off the Seward Highway at mile 108. The victim was a woman with long, dark hair. She had been identified as Kathleen Jo Henry, 52 years old, reported missing by family members who had not heard from her in weeks. The location of the remains was 30 minutes from the Marriott hotel where the footage had been recorded. The timing matched. The description matched. And now, a voice on an SD card gave them a name. The FBI joined the investigation within days, bringing resources that local law enforcement could not access on their own. Federal agents obtained cell phone records for Brian Smith, tracing his movements through the network of towers that covered Anchorage and the surrounding highways. What they found aligned with the footage on the SD card with a precision that left no room for coincidence. On the night of September 4th, Brian's phone had pinged a tower near the Marriott Hotel in Midtown Anchorage. The timestamp matched the metadata on the videos recorded inside room 323. The following day, his phone signaled movement south along the Seward Highway. The tower logs placed him near mile 108, exactly where Kathleen Jo Henry's remains had been discovered by hikers just days later. And on that same SD card, there were photographs. One image showed Kathleen's body in the bed of a pickup truck. The angle of the shot placed the camera inside the cab, looking back through the rear window. The truck was Brian's. The license plate was visible in another photograph recovered from the same folder. The FBI agents presented their findings to the Anchorage detectives, and the weight of the evidence settled into place. Brian Smith had not simply been in the vicinity of the crime. His phone had traveled the exact route from the hotel to the dump site. His truck had been photographed at both locations, and his voice had been recorded directing the final moments of Kathleen Jo Henry's life. There was no alternative explanation. There was no other suspect whose presence could account for the convergence of data, imagery, and audio. The only question that remained was how to apprehend a man who did not yet know he was a suspect. That question became urgent when investigators learned that Brian was not in Alaska. He had left the state with his wife for a vacation in Washington, D.C. The moment Brian Smith's plane touched down at Ted Stevens' Anchorage International Airport, officers were waiting at the gate. They escorted him through the terminal, past the baggage claim, out of the public concourse, and into an unmarked vehicle that carried him directly to the police station. Brian did not resist. He appeared confused but cooperative, offering comments about his trip, asking about the status of his luggage, wondering aloud whether this had something to do with the break-in that had occurred months earlier when someone had smashed his truck window and stolen his GoPro camera. He believed that was why they had brought him in. The detectives who met him in the interrogation room did not correct that assumption. They read him his Miranda rights. They asked routine questions. They let him talk. For nearly an hour, Brian spoke freely about his stolen camera, his outdoor hobbies, his habit of recording everything from camping trips to target practice. He explained that he used SD cards to store his footage. He described the type of cards he preferred, the ones with the green casing he bought at Walmart. He had no idea that the SD card sitting in evidence was not the one he had reported stolen. He had no idea that Valerie Kassler had found it in his phone. He had no idea that on it were videos of him strangling Kathleen Jo Henry. The detectives listened. They nodded. They took notes. And then, when Brian had finished explaining his stolen property, they changed the subject. One of the detectives pulled a photograph from a folder and slid it across the table. It showed a hotel room key card. Marriott, Midtown, Anchorage. Brian looked at it. He said he did not recognize it. The detective slid another photograph across the table. This one showed the interior of a hotel room, the same carpet pattern visible in the videos. Brian's expression did not change. He repeated that he did not recognize it. Then the detective slid a third photograph across the table. This one showed a pair of shoes. They were the shoes Brian was wearing at that moment. The interrogation room grew quiet. Brian looked down at his shoes, then back at the photograph. He acknowledged that the shoes in the picture looked like his. He said he had purchased them recently, though he could not remember exactly when. He said he bought them at Fred Meyer. He said other people owned similar shoes. The detectives did not press the point. Instead, they described the contents of the SD card. They told Brian they had watched the videos multiple times. They told him they had heard the voice on the recordings. They told him they had identified his truck in the photographs. They told him they had matched his cell phone location data to the hotel and to the dump site. Brian listened. He did not ask to see a lawyer. He did not ask to stop the interview. Instead, he began to construct a story. He said he had found something in the back of his truck a few days after Kathleen's death. He said it was dripping, that he had opened the tailgate and discovered a body under a tarp. He said he did not know how it got there. He said he was scared, that no one would believe him, that it was like being caught with drugs in his pocket and claiming they were not his. He said he had driven the body out to mile 108 and left it there. The detectives let him finish. Then they asked him why, if he had found a body in his truck by accident, there were photographs of that same body on his own SD card, in the same folder as the videos from the hotel room. Brian had no answer. He shifted in his chair. He asked for water. When the detectives returned, they brought a laptop. They told Brian they wanted to show him something. They played one of the videos from the SD card. They watched his face as he heard his own voice describing the death of Kathleen Jo Henry. They watched him press his hands together. They watched him close his eyes. And they waited. The interview had stretched for hours. Brian had admitted to dumping Kathleen Henry's body. He had acknowledged that his voice was on the recordings. He had stopped denying that he was the person in the videos. But as the detectives began gathering their notes and preparing to conclude the session, Brian asked if they were in a hurry to leave. They said they were not. Brian leaned forward. He told them he had something else to discuss. He described a night from several years earlier when his wife was away and he had been driving through Anchorage looking for someone to bring home. He found a woman on the street. She was heavily intoxicated, homeless, in need of shelter. He brought her to his house. He gave her food. She fell asleep on his couch. But then, he said, something about her began to bother him. The smell, the risk that she would vomit on his carpet, the fear that his wife would return and discover that a homeless woman had been in the house. He told the woman to take a shower. She refused. He went to his garage and retrieved a pistol. He returned to the living room. The woman was still on the couch. He shot her. He wrapped her body in something, he could not remember what, and placed her in his truck. He drove to a remote area off the Old Glen Highway near the power plant and left her there. He used a laptop to show the detectives the exact location on a map. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. He said he felt better. He said he knew he was going to be on television. He said he was going to be remembered as one of the dumbest criminals in the country. The detectives did not respond immediately. They were already cross-referencing his description with a case file from April 2019, when two mushroom foragers had discovered a human skull in the exact area Brian had indicated. The skull bore a gunshot wound. Dental records had identified the victim as Veronica Abuchuk, 52 years old, who had been missing for years. Before Brian Smith ever sat in that interrogation room, before Valerie Kassler found the SD card, before the remains of Kathleen Henry were discovered off the Seward Highway, another person had already tried to bring him to justice. Her name was Alicia Youngblood. For a time, she had been Brian's secret girlfriend. She met him through mutual acquaintances, drawn to his confidence, his apparent stability, the life he had built for himself in Alaska. But as their relationship deepened, Brian began to show her things he should not have shared. He told her about other women he had brought home. He described his fantasies in detail. And one night he showed her a video. The footage was dark, grainy, but unmistakably real. In it, a woman lay on the floor of a house. The camera moved around her. Brian's voice filled the recording, calm and analytical. Alicia watched until she could not watch anymore. She became convinced that what she had seen was not a fiction, not a performance, but a document of an actual death. She wanted to go to the police immediately, but she was afraid. Brian had shown her the video because he trusted her. If she reported him, he would know who had betrayed him. So she stayed. She continued the relationship. She gathered information when she could, memorizing details, listening to his stories, all while pretending to share his interests. She told investigators later that she had performed acts she found repulsive in order to keep him talking. She said she did it because she believed he would kill again. Eventually, she could not maintain the pretense any longer. She contacted the Anchorage Police Department anonymously and told them what she knew. She gave them Brian's name. She described the video. And then, before the investigation could move forward, she left Alaska. She never testified at Brian's trial. She never saw him sentenced. But the information she provided helped investigators understand the scope of what they were dealing with long before the SD card landed on their desks. On February 22, 2024, after 5 years of investigation, legal proceedings, and the emotional weight of testimony that forced jurors to view footage no person should ever have to see, an Anchorage jury delivered its verdict. The deliberation lasted 2 hours. Brian Stephen Smith was found guilty on all 14 counts: first-degree murder for the death of Kathleen Jo Henry, first-degree murder for the death of Veronica Abuchuk, second-degree murder, sexual assault, tampering with evidence, misconduct involving a corpse. Each charge carried its own weight, its own reminder of the violence documented on the SD card and confessed to in the interrogation room. The judge scheduled sentencing for July. On July 12, 2024, Brian Smith stood before the court and heard the number that would define the rest of his existence: 226 years, a sentence designed to ensure that he would never leave prison alive. He would be eligible for parole only after serving more than a century. The practical effect was permanent incarceration. After the sentencing, the prosecution released a statement emphasizing the courage of Valerie Kassler, whose accidental discovery of the phone had set the investigation in motion. They acknowledged the families of Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abuchuk, who had waited years for accountability, and they noted that without the SD card, without the footage Brian had recorded himself, the case might never have been solved. But even with the verdict delivered and the sentence imposed, one question lingered. Before he moved to Alaska in 2014, Brian Smith had lived in South Africa. Alicia Youngblood, his former girlfriend, had told investigators that he mentioned other victims there. She said one was as young as 15. Alaska authorities have not connected Brian to any additional cases, but the pattern of his behavior, the recording, the preservation, the casual confessions, suggests a man who had done this before. How many folders were on that phone? How many videos did he delete? The answers may never be known.